One moment he was strutting across a stage at a political rally in Hong Kong, defiant and loud as ever, daring the world to come after him. And just hours later, Rodrigo Duterte, the man who once threatened to feed international investigators to crocodiles, was in handcuffs at Manila's Ninoy Aquino International Airport, about to board a plane to The Hague. What happened on March 11, 2025, did not just shake the Philippines to its foundation. It sent a tremor through the corridors of power in Beijing, Washington, and every capital where a strongman leader believed he was permanently beyond reach. This is the story of the arrest that nobody saw coming, the political chess game that made it possible, and why some of the most powerful nations on earth chose to say absolutely nothing when it happened. To understand the full weight of what went down, you have to go back to the beginning of Rodrigo Duterte's rise. He was the mayor of Davao City for years before he ever became president, and during that time, he was widely credited, and widely feared, for transforming a once lawless city into one of the most orderly in the Philippines. But the methods behind that transformation were dark. Human rights investigators would later link his administration in Davao to a shadowy group of operatives known as the Davao Death Squad, responsible for hundreds of extrajudicial killings targeting suspected criminals, drug users, and street children. Duterte never denied his philosophy. He openly talked about targeting people he considered a menace to society. He normalized the language of elimination in public life long before he ever occupied Malacanang Palace. When Duterte won the Philippine presidency in 2016, he did so by taking that same philosophy national. His war on drugs became one of the most aggressive and deadly anti-narcotics campaigns any democratic country had ever seen. Within months of taking office, police and unidentified gunmen were killing dozens of people per night in the slums of Manila, Cebu, and Davao. The official government count would eventually exceed 6,000 deaths, though human rights groups, citing data collected from police blotters, hospital records, and witness testimonies, placed the actual number at anywhere from 12,000 to over 30,000. Many of those killed were impoverished Filipinos from urban barangays who never saw a trial, never faced a judge, and whose families were handed nothing but a body and a placard claiming the victim had fought back. The pattern was systematic. The evidence trail was enormous, and the International Criminal Court was watching. The ICC opened a preliminary examination into the Philippine drug war in 2016, just months after Duterte took office. For Duterte, this was an intolerable provocation. He called the court a tool of Western imperialism. He mocked international law. And in March 2018, he did something no sitting president of a treaty member nation had ever done quite so openly and defiantly. He announced that the Philippines was withdrawing from the Rome Statute, the founding document of the ICC. The withdrawal took formal effect in March 2019, and Duterte declared himself legally untouchable. He believed that by pulling his country out of the court's jurisdiction, he had slammed a door shut forever. What he did not anticipate was that the Philippine Supreme Court would later rule that the ICC retained jurisdiction over crimes committed during the years the Philippines was still a member, which covered the entire first stretch of his drug war from 2016 to 2019. But even with that legal door technically open, there was little practical chance of the ICC moving against Duterte as long as the Philippine government itself refused to cooperate. And for years, it did not cooperate. The administration of Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who succeeded Duterte in 2022, initially maintained the same hostile posture toward the ICC that Duterte himself had established. The Marcos government challenged the court's jurisdiction and insisted that the Philippine justice system was capable of handling any accountability question domestically. Critics pointed out the obvious irony. A government with its own complicated history of human rights violations, dating back to Ferdinand Marcos Sr.'s martial law era, was now defending the man responsible for thousands of extrajudicial killings. The world watched and largely assumed that Duterte would live out his remaining years untouched. What changed everything was not a legal epiphany. It was politics, raw and personal. The alliance between the Marcos and Duterte families had been one of the defining features of the 2022 Philippine elections. Bongbong Marcos ran for president while Sara Duterte, Rodrigo's daughter, ran as his vice presidential running mate. They won in a landslide, presenting themselves as a unified front of two of the most powerful political dynasties in Philippine history. But alliances built on convenience rarely survive the pressure of governance. By 2024, cracks had become chasms. Sara Duterte resigned from the cabinet. Tensions between the two camps escalated in public view. And then, in a move that stunned even seasoned political observers, Congress moved to impeach Sara Duterte on charges of corruption and misconduct in office. The Marcos-Duterte alliance was not just broken. It was weaponized. It was in this context that the Marcos administration quietly began changing its tone on the ICC. By November 2024, government officials were signaling that Manila would cooperate with Interpol if an arrest warrant were issued. The shift was so significant and so sudden that many legal observers suspected the Marcos administration already knew what was coming. The ICC had been working on the Duterte case behind closed doors for years, gathering evidence, reviewing testimonies, and assembling the legal grounds needed for a warrant. The warrant was finally issued by ICC Pretrial Chamber 1 on March 7, 2025. For 4 days, it remained classified as a secret document, known only to a handful of people in The Hague and in Manila. Then, on March 11, everything moved at once. Duterte had flown to Hong Kong a few days earlier for what was described as a political rally among overseas Filipino workers. His allies and supporters had no idea that by the time he landed back in Manila, the walls had already closed in around him. The Philippine National Police, under the leadership of General Nicolas Torre, had spent months quietly drafting an 80-page arrest plan internally codenamed Operation Pursuit. The document mapped out scenarios for every possible location where Duterte might be apprehended, from his home in Davao to the streets of Manila. When Duterte arrived at Ninoy Aquino International Airport on the night of March 11, the plan was activated. Philippine police, acting on the Interpol red notice tied to the ICC warrant, moved swiftly and without incident. Rodrigo Duterte, the man who had once boasted that no one would ever dare come for him, offered no resistance. Hours later, President Bongbong Marcos went before the cameras to confirm what had already spread across social media like wildfire. He announced that an aircraft carrying his predecessor had departed Manila at 11 minutes past 11 that evening, bound for the Netherlands. He was careful in his language, emphasizing that Philippine authorities had acted in coordination with Interpol, not directly with the ICC, framing the cooperation as consistent with the country's obligations to international law enforcement rather than an explicit embrace of the court from which the Philippines had withdrawn. Legal analysts called it a clever piece of diplomatic positioning. Critics called it a political maneuver designed to eliminate the most dangerous rival the Marcos administration faced. Whatever the motivation, the result was the same. For the first time in history, a former Asian head of state was in ICC custody, facing charges of crimes against humanity. The reaction inside the Philippines was immediate and deeply divided. In the streets of Manila, some residents wept with relief and flocked to churches to pray for the families of drug war victims, people who had spent years demanding justice and being dismissed. Survivors and grieving parents who had never seen a single senior official held accountable now dared to hope that something had fundamentally changed. In Davao City, Duterte's political stronghold, the reaction was the opposite. Crowds gathered in protest. Supporters waved banners denouncing the arrest as a kidnapping, as a political conspiracy, as a betrayal of a man they believed had saved the country from the chaos of illegal drugs. Within 12 hours of the arrest, 200 Facebook pages and accounts had posted identical texts claiming that police had abducted Duterte without legal basis, a wave of coordinated messaging that investigators quickly identified as a disinformation campaign. Then came China. And China's reaction, or more precisely, the restrained and carefully worded nature of it, told a story all its own. Duterte had been one of Beijing's greatest strategic prizes in Southeast Asia. When he came to power in 2016, he immediately pivoted away from the United States, calling for a separation from Washington, announcing plans to buy arms from Russia and China, and describing his foreign policy as an independent one free from American influence. He downplayed the landmark 2016 arbitration ruling that had affirmed the Philippines' sovereign rights in the South China Sea, a ruling that Beijing had always rejected. He pursued billions of dollars in promised Chinese infrastructure investment and cultivated a personal relationship with President Xi Jinping that was warm enough to generate photographs of the two men laughing together at summit meetings. For China, Duterte was not just a friend. He was a geopolitical asset. When the ICC arrested that asset and sent him to The Hague, Beijing's foreign ministry responded through spokesperson Mao Ning, who called on the ICC to exercise its functions prudently and to avoid what China described as double standards. The statement was pointed and deliberate, a clear signal that Beijing viewed the arrest as selective justice targeting a leader who had been friendly toward China while more powerful figures in more powerful countries continued to evade accountability. The Chinese government also pointedly noted that Beijing had consistently maintained the position that the ICC should not be used as a political instrument. But here was the telling detail: China did not threaten consequences. It did not announce sanctions. It did not make any move to intervene on Duterte's behalf. The man China had cultivated and championed as a counterweight to American influence in Manila was now on his way to The Hague, and Beijing essentially stood at the side and watched. The United States presented an equally complex picture. Donald Trump, who had returned to the White House, had his own complicated relationship with both Duterte and the ICC. Back in 2017, a leaked transcript of a phone call between Trump and Duterte had shown the then-American president praising the Philippine leader's drug war approach in glowing terms. Trump had described the campaign as the right way to handle the drug problem, a remark that horrified human rights advocates. Years later, Trump's administration sanctioned ICC investigators, freezing their assets and barring them from the United States in response to the court's actions related to Israel and Afghanistan. So when Duterte's arrest came through, many Duterte supporters in the Philippines assumed, or hoped, that Trump would intervene. Fake executive orders circulated on social media, claiming Trump had demanded Duterte's immediate release. None of it was real. The White House issued no statement on the Duterte arrest. Trump said nothing publicly. The silence from Washington was not accidental. It reflected the increasingly pragmatic and transactional nature of American foreign policy under Trump, a policy that had little appetite for making a high-profile defense of a foreign ex-leader who was no longer strategically useful. The Philippines under Marcos had actually moved significantly closer to the United States in military and strategic terms. The Marcos administration had expanded access for American forces to Philippine military bases, a direct reversal of the Duterte-era pivot toward China. From Washington's perspective, Marcos was now the useful ally, and defending Duterte would only complicate the relationship with Manila. So the Trump administration stayed quiet, and in doing so, implicitly allowed the ICC process to proceed unimpeded, at least as far as Duterte was concerned. The geopolitical implications of all this extended far beyond the Philippines. For years, critics of the ICC had argued that the court was effectively a tool of the powerful West, capable of pursuing cases in Africa and in politically convenient locations while remaining toothless in the face of leaders backed by major powers. There is genuine truth in that critique. The ICC has spent the bulk of its existence prosecuting African leaders. Its arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin, issued over the conflict in Ukraine, remains unexecuted because Russia would never surrender him. Its warrant for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, related to the situation in Gaza, triggered a fierce diplomatic backlash led by the United States. But Duterte's case was different, and the difference mattered enormously. Here was a former head of government who was arrested not because an external power forced the issue, but because his own successor government chose to cooperate. The system worked not through raw power, but through the collapse of a domestic political alliance. The legal road ahead for Duterte remained complicated in ways that even the most seasoned international law experts acknowledged openly. Duterte, who was 79 years old at the time of his arrest, had publicly claimed he suffered from a degenerative nerve condition. His lawyers immediately began filing motions challenging the ICC's jurisdiction over him, arguing that the Philippines' withdrawal from the Rome Statute in 2019 had stripped the court of any authority to try him. But the ICC's pre-trial chamber had already addressed that argument in the warrant itself, noting that the crimes Duterte was charged with had occurred during the period of Philippine membership, and that the court's founding treaty provides that withdrawal does not affect cases already under examination. The legal argument was not new, and the court had seen it coming. Duterte's trial, if it proceeded on schedule, was expected to begin sometime in September 2025, potentially making him the first former Asian leader ever convicted by an international tribunal. Sara Duterte, the former vice president and the deposed political heir to her father's movement, publicly announced shortly after the arrest that she would not return to the Philippines for an indefinite period. She traveled to The Hague and pledged to focus on building her father's legal defense team, a move that underscored both her personal commitment and the political dimension of the case. Back in Manila, she faced her own legal jeopardy in the form of the impeachment proceedings that Congress had already launched against her. The Duterte political machine, which had once seemed invincible, was now fighting battles on multiple fronts simultaneously, with its patriarch behind bars in the Netherlands and its political future deeply uncertain at home. What made the entire situation even more remarkable was the broader philosophical question it raised about power, accountability, and the nature of international justice. Duterte had built his entire political identity around the idea that strength was the only real currency in governance, that rules were for the weak, that international institutions were nothing more than facades erected by hypocritical Western powers to maintain dominance over smaller nations. He had spent years mocking the ICC, laughing off its investigations, and encouraging his supporters to view any attempt at accountability as an attack on Philippine sovereignty. And yet, in the end, it was not a Western power that brought him down. It was his own political system, his own country, his own successors, who handed him over to the court he had spent years ridiculing. The irony was almost too rich to absorb. For the thousands of Filipino families who had lost loved ones during the drug war years, the arrest was not simply a political development or a legal milestone. It was something far more personal. Mothers who had spent years filing complaints that went nowhere. Fathers who had buried children killed in nighttime raids by officers who claimed the victim had drawn a weapon. Siblings who had testified before human rights bodies and been ignored. These were ordinary people from Manila's Tondo district, from the streets of Caloocan, from slum communities in Cebu and Davao, who had been told again and again that no one powerful enough to help them was listening. On March 11, 2025, they had reason, for the first time, to believe that someone had finally heard them. The story of Rodrigo Duterte's arrest is ultimately a story about the fragility of impunity. For years, the conventional wisdom was that leaders like Duterte operated in a space permanently beyond accountability because they controlled the institutions that might otherwise pursue them. The ICC warrant sat in a file for years precisely because the Philippine government would not cooperate, and everyone understood that without domestic cooperation, the warrant was merely paper. What changed was not the court, not international pressure, not the advocacy of human rights groups, though all of those mattered. What changed was a political falling out between two dynasties that had once been allied. History does not always move in the direction of justice, and sometimes when it does, it moves there through the most unexpected and least noble of paths. But in this case, whatever the motivation behind the Marcos administration's decision, thousands of grieving Filipino families are closer to a form of justice they were told they would never see. And across the world, in palaces and presidential compounds where other strongmen are watching this unfold very carefully, a lesson is being absorbed slowly, quietly, and with no small amount of dread.